Hello, everyone joining us. We will have Richard Beckett joining us very shortly. This is going to be the penultimate session of this series. So we will be ending this series next week we will have Professor Claudia Pasquero and we will have Maria Kapsova. Both of them have a number of activities in their folio. So I won't read out their bios now, but essentially that will be our closing session for this series, which for those of us that have joined it so far, you will know that we're very much centered on biofutures in design, in production, in cities, and effectively the physical world. What will happen is as soon as this series has finished, the insights and the visions from our various participants will be compiled into a number of pieces. So there will be a couple of articles, there will be a zine, and there will be a paper that effectively will just bring it all together in a way that is open access. And I will share that with you when that comes out. And then we will have our second series will launch probably around about early autumn. And we'll be focusing in that second series on the body and on prostheses and on really all of the things that are, if you like, in direct contact with we as humans as opposed to our wider built environment. Now I'm just going to send another invitation to Richard, and then we should start very, very shortly. I'm just tapping the screen to invite him right now. And I'm also just going to send Richard an email just in case last week when Rachel was joining us, we had a little bit of a connection issue trying to splice her into the call. So I'm just going to let Richard know. Richard, I've sent you an invitation, but it's for some reason we've got a glitch. I can see you're joining. So yeah, if you send me an invitation, I will accept it and then we'll be good to go. Great. Richard should be coming into the conversation any moment now. So as with all the previous sessions, if you have any questions, then do put them in the comments. Use the comments as opposed to the little question box because it's easier for us to see in real time as we're going through it. So just see if, just going to accept Richard again. Seems that Instagram's a little bit glitchy at the moment, so I'm sorry if we've got a couple of issues trying to so I think what we have to do, so Richard, I think I can see you're watching. If you disconnect from this call and then you try and connect with me again, I'm pressing your connection request and I'm trying to send you them and it's still not doing it, but we can figure this out. Oh, here he is. Here he is.
Hey, can you see me now?
Yeah, we've managed, you know, it reminds me, the number of glitches we've had with this platform. It reminds me, last year I was doing a podcast with a couple of academics and we were having a whole load of glitches, and we did joke that as we had 3 PhDs between us, we should be able to figure it out. So yeah, I can hear you. I can't see you at the moment.
Yeah, I don't see myself at all. What am I doing wrong?
You might have to reverse your camera on your phone. That's the only thing I can think of.
Oh, yeah, we do that. Let's try that one. There we are.
There you are.
That's it. You were looking at the back of my computer.
Don't worry, don't worry. Thank you so much for joining us today. Have you managed to see any of the other sessions in our series yet?
Little bits. I didn't manage to see. I have kids, you see, so at this kind of time of night, it's very hard to sit through it all. So yeah, bits and bobs.
Absolutely, yeah. We have had pretty lengthy sessions. I know usually that with Instagram sessions, they make them last maybe about 20 minutes. We've been knocking out definitely more than 45, averaging about an hour. Most of the time, folks have popped in and out, and then obviously the videos, they can always go back to them when they need to. But thank you for making the time to join us this evening. I thought we'd maybe kick off with just a little bit about how you arrived working where you are, because like a lot of those that join, if you like, the interface of human and non-human systems, you came originally from another area of activity. You were a scientist, so maybe just guide us in as to how you went from there to here, and you know, what really attracted you to working in the field that you are now.
Yeah, I think my first degree, going back to a long time ago was actually in sort of physiology and biochemistry, and after that I ended up working at GlaxoSmithKline as a research scientist. So I have a background, in sort of biology and biochemistry, but I think architecture was always my passion. And yeah, there came a time where I was sort of doing the science, and it became pretty clear that it probably wasn't something that I was going to be or wanting to do for the rest of my life. So I made the sort of decision to change, and that happened. And I studied, so I studied initially at Westminster for my undergraduate, and then I did my part two at the Bartlett. And really, from that point, it was at the Bartlett where there was that potential to engage the sort of the science background with architecture. And I think that was partly as a result of the tutors I was with. I was with Marcus Cruz and Marion Coletti at the time, who were two people interested in those sorts of areas, obviously, and they were there to encourage that kind of interdisciplinary approach, which was still quite new, I think, back then, into it. And really, that was where it started. So my sort of master's projects coming through the Bartlett were, the first steps in engaging in this kind of agenda, very much materially driven at the time, but also computationally and digitally, I guess, in that sense of the discourse between material and computation. And then, funnily enough, I never actually left the Bartlett after that. So after the part two, I got a job at the Bartlett. I was leading a lot of the digital fabrication as part of the BMade workshops at the time through 3D printing. And really, from that point on, the work, kind of gained its own kind of traction as more of a research agenda. And so I started teaching at the Bartlett, and at some point I did start a PhD, which is sort of ongoing, unfortunately, for a long time now. And yeah, that kind of really kind of pulls together the last sort of maybe eight years of work, really, that have been addressing this kind of broadly digital material agenda.
So, a lot, as with a lot of the people in this series, your career to date has been a bit of a mix. You are part educator, part researcher, part practitioner. And I read that as well. You also have consulting. You consult as well on areas of digital fabrication. Is that correct?
Yeah, less so now. I mean, I think that was happening for a while those kind of emerging 3D printing technologies were still quite new. I mean, it's not that they're old fashioned anymore, but they're definitely not new anymore. So yeah, it's my role at the Bartlett is teaching and research. And then there's always been an agenda. I think ever since I finished the part two was to really engage with making more physically, kind of actually making this work rather than it always being digital and renderings and that kind of thing. And so the need to kind of produce and engage with ongoing projects has been part of that work.
Brilliant. And the Bartlett really is a magnet for this. I mean, it's certainly got some of the very most exciting courses within this arena. I mean, it's not just got one, it's got a whole folio, hasn't it, of different bachelor's, masters, PhDs going on. More actually activity now than I could count. And as you say, it's very much grown. We're in a very different position now to where we were 10 years ago. What do you think it is about the Bartlett that has particularly enabled that, if we compare it to some of the other institutions that are not in that place yet?
Sure. Yeah, I'm not sure how to sort of compare it directly. It's just that the Bartlett has always had that experimental ethos underlying the design approaches, and it was always encouraged at all points where I've been through the Bartlett, both in terms of being a student, but also in the early kind of years of teaching. It was to give people the confidence to be experimental. And obviously the diversity of tutors and voices that you have at the Bartlett, it was kind of, it enabled a lot of that. I use the word confidence, meant just this ability to be experimental with the stuff, which, I think is still there. Obviously the emergence of the new courses has just broadened that spectrum of the amount of work that's going on there. And it's a fantastic place to be.
Well, looking through your works, you've obviously done a lot of work in biodigital, and of late you've been looking at the Probiotic City, nearly as opposed to the antibiotic city. Just thinking for a while about biodigital. I would say, when I think to the progress within digital, not biodigital, but digital more generally, within what is effectively 30 years, we have seen the equivalent in terms of technical capacity of, certainly in terms of processing and things like backing up your creations that I would equate with comparing a Roman chariot with a NASA rocket, in that back in the early 1990s, when I was doing digital designs, the process of even creating a simple design was very time consuming. And then the business of backing it up would literally take hours. I mean, you could leave your system saving the data and go off and have your dinner, go off for the evening, and then come back and it would still be cranking on through. Whereas today, literally everything is instantaneous. You can create really very complex work and it can be backed up within no time at all. And obviously that varies a little bit if it's a motion, if there are motion graphics and so forth, but there is really no comparison. When you think about biodigital as a domain, what is the speed of progression in terms of, let's say where we were 15 years ago, where we were 7 years ago, and where we are now?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree to a point. I mean, definitely the speed of computation and the speed of being able to back up has happened. I mean, I still don't think weirdly it's any quicker to design in a digital way or a biodigital way. The complexities involved in producing design outputs from these things are still weirdly incredibly slow, even if they appear on the surface to be quicker. With the biodigital, I mean, my work has always been so materially driven. I know that there'll be other people that are more focused on the biological computation side. So I don't have an awful lot to say on the biological computation side, because it's not so much of what I do. The material agenda has always been slightly slower because of the realities of making, because of the realities of translation of those models into fabrication, and even with the developments in technology that have allowed that, the biological processes have always been a time limiting factor, haven't they? So that kind of the speed of computation and translation of digital information across file formats and across programs has of course got significantly quicker. But the relationship between biological growth and those digital models doesn't speed up in the same way, does it? And so, we're massively further on ahead 10 years, but it's definitely not at the same pace as computational systems have developed. And I think, it's always a challenge, isn't it? That you're looking for new ways and new things. But I think we definitely go through periods in the biodigital biodesign world, and I think we're emerging out of what might be a slow period and coming back into a new area of production. I think predominantly through the amount of new people involved in this area, we're starting to see that bear its fruits now, I guess.
So in terms of this, if you like, the qualitative difference, to take biodigital versus what we'll call e-tech digital as a comparison, you're already speaking to a distinct difference there, in that the processes of biology can work more slowly, as opposed to some of the computational processes. But thinking to the differences more generally, throughout the series, we've had various conversations about how, be it that you're a materials, you're developing and researching materials, or you're a designer, if you like, the fundamental differences between business as was usual, the sort of industrial production model, and this new bio-revolutionary model where, we are having to work with the various qualities of living systems. Apart from the speed of certain processes, what are the other kind of differences that you notice between digital and biodigital as applies to what you're doing?
I'm not sure I necessarily have an answer for that. Can you reframe it slightly?
So if you were to think about, in what way have you found it? I mean, you might not have, of course, but if you're thinking about comparing working with living systems, working with that which is biological and that which is non-biological, what are the kind of differences, apart from perhaps the speeds of certain processes in that process? So for example, have you noticed any differentials in scale of activity, or in the complexity of the design process, or something else, or perhaps not at all?
Okay. I mean, I don't know if I'm answering this exactly how you want it. But obviously when I sort of talked about the biodesign scene is starting to bear fruits a little bit, and I mentioned sort of maybe a period of slowing down. And I think there was a period of time where the scalability of of sort of petri dish experiments was dominating the biodesign scene. And I know this is not fundamentally biodigital. Again, I'm approaching biodigital from the relationship between geometry and biology, which is very different, I know, from how others are engaging with it. But there was a real period of time where biodigital design in that sense just wasn't emerging out of the petri dish. And at a time where, architecture especially really shifted from, what were traditionally kind of architectural models in a sort of a master's discourse, the small 1 to 200 scale models of buildings shifted to the prototype. And there was a real kind of an agenda initially for the biodesign agenda to engage with that as well. But then scale really became that issue. And what we tended to see was, a lot of kind of small scale desktop stuff. And it's still a big challenge across any of the groups that we see really trying to engage with this. And how do you engage with this architectural agenda of the one-to-one prototype with these kind of what are usually very slow, what are usually typically quite expensive, or energy intensive, means literally energy intensive of doing these kind of things, and so that kind of scale thing didn't really translate in the same way. So I don't know if that's answering exactly kind of what you were asking, but that would be my kind of position on this, and hopefully that we're starting to see the other side of that now with the kind of the development of the material research that's gone on, and the kind of the build up of learning knowledge is allowing people finally, I think, to break through a little bit those kind of small things happening on a desk, which were always looked very interesting, but we were never quite sure what they were trying to be at an architectural scale.
And that's thinking to some of the crits I've done and looking to some of the students' work, and also to international awards. I've found that of this past several years, one of the big challenges at the architectural scale for working with that which is generally biological has been an issue of scale. It's been the issue of at what scale do you apply the rules, as it were, of the biological world? How do they translate into architectural structures and into infrastructure in a way that is meaningful? Because although it's relatively, if not very easy to, as it were, to take the fundamental principles of the aesthetics of nature and to scale those, if you're thinking about actually tackling critical environmental problems, if you're thinking about things like how an architectural schema is going to address climate change or resource shortages or what have you, that was certainly one of the problems that was coming up, and where a lot of projects were falling over. But I have seen quite a significant improvement, and it seems to me that is partly a product, if not significantly a product, of the fact that we've now got such a bigger body of research, such a bigger body of projects to look to, and they're in more to relate to, and more to use as a reference when you're trying to work out quite how you make meaningful architectural schemas with this discipline. Would you say that is your experience too?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, it also translates across to trying to apply these kind of projects early on to real world projects, which usually involved either trying to work in some way with a commission, or people coming to you, or you approaching people with ideas for, in architecture, the scale of the pavilions or things like that. It was always incredibly hard to really apply these things onto real projects, differently from if you were doing something much more known with, inanimate materials. And so I think that really slowed things down. And I think you're right, is that the body of work that acts as precedent for not only engagement with the designer, but also with engagement with people that potentially could be applying this work on projects, and just having references to look at and examples generally is helping people to feel more secure in trying these things. Look, because ultimately real buildings are very expensive, all right? And so to take huge risks on real buildings, these chances are rare. And so this is why I think often it's often been explored at the scale of the pavilion. Engagement with real buildings has always seen the biodigital emerge down the more engineering route, hasn't it? Less probably experimental and artistic, and more engineering, because it was always quantitative, right? I mean, I remember in the early stages of some of the work we were doing, people were constantly asking us to be able to quantify as a square meter value of how much carbon we might absorb with one of these kind of living systems. And we were never doing that, right? We're not engineers. We didn't even have the methodologies at the time to be able. I'm not sure we still do. So yeah, it was incredibly hard to ever get to really try these on, and hence they tended to remain a little bit academic. Are you coming back?
Yeah, sorry about that. My I thought I got my phone plugged in to charge up, but there's a problem with the socket, so I'm just fiddling around
No,
with
no.
my power. Don't worry, it's a minor tech issue. I will be back in a second. There, we should be good
No,
now. I don't want the phone to run out of battery.
you get the warning lights.
Yeah, we should be good. Sorry. Yeah, continue.
No, I mean, it was just the point about making how a lot of these projects were really difficult to get into real world projects. And so they tended to remain academic. And, you know, it's always been a struggle of, you know, disseminating academic research in some kind of real world environment in order to convince people that you could do these things on real projects. And the body of work, I think, or hope, will be making those things easier, right?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, no, I think that, you know, that's the general trend, but, you know, I sort of asked for a second opinion on that because sometimes, you know, it can be hard to know if your experience of it is really on a par with that of your peers. But it definitely feels as if this arena is getting really a better idea of, I guess you could say, the potential and the relevance of the work that is being done. And also, you know, the issue you were saying about effectively how you quantify the value, that for this, one of the key themes that's come out in the series is that is a challenge for the biofutures community more generally, in that we are typically working to quite different parameters, and we're not typically looking at just one means of evaluation. It's not just about the, for sake of argument, embodied carbon or even about climate change. It's about a whole swathe of issues that are being approached very systemically. But of course, the sort of the evaluation criteria, even if we look to some of the most sophisticated, certainly as far as the built environment community is concerned, some of the most sophisticated means as implemented of present for evaluating the validity of sustainability credentials, they are nowhere near close to where this community is operating systemically. So I think that's a really, you know, key point, and certainly it's resonating with the other conversations that we've been having in this series.
Yeah, I mean, to give an example, just quickly on that, was however long ago it was, maybe back in something like 2012. Marcus, Cruz, and myself, we started CindyBio, right, which was at the time was a sort of a dissemination website for this kind of work. And I think when you looked at the biodesign broader scheme, or even biodigital, if you want to talk about that, at that time there was a lot of material stuff going on. There was a lot of stuff going in the arts, and there was a gap there that where we could differentiate what we were trying to do within this sort of dissemination tool, which was about architecture. And we kind of made a choice at that time to not show speculative projects and to try to only show projects that were being built or had been built. And I think at the time, you know, the green wall was still fairly new, I guess. And we had a few of those examples on there. And then we were looking around the world at the time. There was the BIQ, the Algae House, which is in Hamburg, which is a really seminal project within this agenda. And then there were sort of, you know, a couple of other projects, and then there were academics, which was, you know, involved us. It involved academics like Claudia Pasquero and Ecologic Studio. And we sort of had this body of work which served for the launch of this CindyBio. And then it became one of them things where, you know, when you do these websites, everybody knows you have to update them, right? And the updating initially with enthusiasm goes well, but actually what we found was after a couple of years, we were running out of projects to add to it, because we had this distinction of saying, well, we really want to try and do stuff that's built, right? We know there's a lot of speculative and academic work going on, but we want to try and keep this in some way physical. And it really did become that little bit of that for a while, where there actually wasn't many projects going on other than being led by the academics. And so the disconnect between, I guess, what, you know, this super interesting work that we all love to talk about and actually what's happening in the world was very slow. Weirdly, I felt if there was a need to ever update that, things might be slightly different now, but there still wouldn't be 200 projects to put on there, right? There would be probably a handful.
Yeah, and that likewise is my experience. I mean, I've been curating Bionic City magazine now, which spun out of the Bionic City project since 2013. Yeah. There are over 2,300 articles, but in all honesty, I haven't actually updated it for, well, what would now be a couple of months, because it got to the point where it was almost to the point of saturation, wherein there were a lot of very, very interesting projects, but we reached a point where there was very little new that was coming through that actually in some way was different to what had come before. But it feels to me there's almost a bit of a glut, because there's certainly a lot of really interesting work going on out there. But a lot of it just hasn't come through yet. And I think part of that is looking at the sort of the enablement of these things, because, you know, we're still in a situation where actually getting funding for the research and development of this is still not easy, because you know, there is funding, but that's not necessarily what there needs to be. And also, I mean, I think partly visibility in that, you know, I don't, in all honesty, think that within the wider built environment community, there is a real understanding of just what the potential within these fields are. And so, although within and of the community in itself, there is that understanding, you know, external to that, some of the sort of narratives are actually very, very old. They're quite weak in terms of the built environment sustainability criteria that many orgs are still working to. So I think we will see maybe a little bit of a sort of not an explosion of new works, but I think certainly it slowed down, and there is certainly potential to really speed these things up and to really, as you say, get some really great physical test cases to show.
I mean, for me, it's a bit of a call to the younger generation, though, is that the opportunities really are there. I mean, if you imagine, you go back 10 years ago, how many architecture students were graduating with an interest in this? It might have been a handful, it might have been 20. I mean, now you're looking at, you know, 4 or 5 times those numbers, if not more, as well as the guys coming from other disciplines in terms of fashion and jewelry. The big challenge is, how do you, you know, as a teacher and as someone interested in things, how do we make sure that people are coming away with enough confidence that this is not just something they do that's a bit interesting while they're at university, and the risk then they get, we call it the sort of the black hole of architecture, where you get sucked into, you know, the real world and a real practice where to be able to do this is impossible. How do we kind of enable and encourage and try and give the students the confidence that this stuff is valid, and try to pursue it beyond just the academic project, right?
And that rings exactly with what Nancy Dines was saying. She was one of the first people in the series. Nancy was saying that a lot of her students had come to her at some point and said, you know, they loved what they were doing, but they didn't necessarily have the confidence that they could go out into industry with their various biodesign projects and get a job. And, you know, and Nancy, you know, said that she tells her students to be confident, to keep doing what they're doing. And I would say that as well. I mean, you know, when I think back, I was researching biomaterials and biodesign when I was, well, in my second year of my bachelor's degree back in the early 90s. Yep. And my sense then was there was no way, absolutely no way I could take any of this stuff to industry, because the only other person that I knew of in the world was Hussein Chalayan, who was at Central Smartins. He had actually focused a collection on this.
Yes.
But it did seem that, you know, no one is going to even understand what you're trying to do, let alone actually create a job for you, which obviously, when you're young and you don't know how to run a business, you're looking for someone to kind of take you in and nurture you and develop those skills. But you know, I definitely think that, I mean, with this series, I've already had some really positive responses from industry, so I know that they're out there and they're looking, and I'm really hoping that it will just start to really perk attention and show those that do have the gravitas, as it were, to create new opportunities, that this really is at the time to be getting involved and to be developing the platforms that can, you know, put in place not only the funding, but also to look at the regulatory issues, because as we know, qualitatively, particularly when you're dealing with the built environment, there's no way that some of these concepts could be implemented if it's not the case that the building regulations and the various frameworks that enable things to be built change. And I think kind of a marker of where we are is, I reviewed the policies for vertical gardens back in 2018, and it was so patchy. It was there was so many holes in the regulation that even at that level, even at the level of literally just cladding essentially modernist buildings in plants, the policy was, you know, not light years away, but it had a lot of work to be done. And so when we think about this work, it's, well, you know, that is something that needs a lot of expertise, both in terms of the materiality and the technicality of this, and also in terms of how Dickens, you actually splice this into the wider building frameworks, and so that the big developers, the big architectural firms, the investors in these schema can really get behind it, and we can start to see the scaling of these brilliant ideas and brilliant new methodologies and approaches that are coming out of places like the Bartlett.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there is a comparison again with sort of computation in general here, isn't there? Where there was there still is a period, I guess, where the level of computation that's going on in academia is far beyond what actually happens in practice, right? And I do know of examples where, there are students who come out with these amazing computational skills, and they are being brought into offices and they are being given a platform to some extent to bring that into the office, right? And I think we can hope for the same thing within terms of materiality and sort of living agencies. Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. And thinking to the potential for, I mean, we'll move on to probiotics in a minute. I haven't forgotten that. I'm just expanding on the biodigital at the moment. Thinking about some of the ways in which the research that you and your peers are doing, how do you think it could help us tackle some of the really critical issues that are facing society, and especially as relates to the built environment? And with that, how do you think that this work can provide of exciting opportunities, really new areas of opportunity for those, that are working within it to catalyze new concepts, to genuinely pioneer for the future?
Well, remind me what was the first bit of the question?
The first bit of the question was, what do you think the potential is in terms of how this could help to tackle some of the big issues of our time? I
mean, maybe this is leading into the kind of stuff we do, but part of the reasons that a lot of this work is not easily applicable at the moment is to do with sort of perceptions, mentalities, and philosophies of what buildings should be, of what cities should be, and if you add into that the fact that, to take London as an example, and I don't know figures, but you can well imagine that a high percentage of actually work getting built is probably not being led by architects in the first instance. So yeah, it's about, this work has the ability, I guess, to engage with contemporary understandings. Of course, climate emergency is a big part of that, but there are other key issues, aren't there, to do with equality and fairness and shifts in power that I think are fundamentally related. I always enjoy listening to some of the social scientists when they kind of talk about this stuff. They're much better at it, obviously, than I am. But to view these things as assemblages and not individual strands, they're always tied in. Okay, and the built environment is usually implicit in many of these assemblies or entanglements, however you want to call them. And so it is as well about kind of changing perceptions of what architecture is, what a building should be, and that was always the agenda of, especially within the Bartlett, was to be experimental both in your methodologies, but also to question the way we build buildings, the way we procure buildings, but ultimately the way we inhabit buildings. And I still think that there's a high volume world view that still is based on kind of mentalities, which I think we can make strong arguments for now that can be recalibrated.
Yeah.
Forget the second one.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things I noticed with, I guess you could say, biological thinking as it relates to the built environment more generally, is that there are a couple of common themes, because obviously temporality is one of them. And the question of, if you create something, how long do you actually need it to be? But obviously that's not a new theme. That's something that the likes of Cedric Price were obviously interrogating in detail decades ago. So temporality also, the question of, does it need to be built? Is a building the best architectural solution, or can you configure space in a different way? Which is why I think it's really interesting that we are, seeing such interest in what is effectively an old concept, the metaverse. Of course, anyone who's, was knocking around when not only Second Life, but when its predecessors were launching, kind of, it's just a new name for something that's been around a very long time. But it is definitely sort of at the scale now that there is, massive interest, massive engagement, big money going into the metaverse. And obviously that's interesting, because that is effectively, that's a new a new dimension for architectural space, a new place that we can actually convene, we can engage in various transactions. So it does feel like that, you know, there's a lot of rethinking of space, and that is a general theme that's coming up. And obviously the kind of cyclicality, which is obviously to do with temporality, cyclicality of things. How do you see cyclicality very much expressed in the work that you're doing, in the nature of the processes, or not? Do you see something else?
Yeah, it's weirdly it's always been in my work, but it's not been a sort of a major part of it. I mean, there was I don't know if I ever made a decision at any point to only engage with materials that was you know, in a bracket of sustainability. I think that just came hand in hand with the type of work I was doing, because generally, if you want to integrate any kind of living systems into materials and architecture, they tend to need to be non-toxic and, you know, chemically fairly inert, which kind of immediately rules out many of the kind of materials that we want to stop using anyway, right? So there was always an engagement to try to do that. The sort of the circularity for me comes through more to do with kind of relationships between the human and non-human, rather than necessarily direct material agendas. But it's funny that, you know, that you sort of say, you know, you look back and these ideas are not new. You know, there's a sense that we're always trying to search for new ideas, and then as soon as you get into these, what you think you have a new idea, you find the historical references. And I think, you know, the dream has always been, can we grow a building? Right, that was always the ultimate. And when you looked at kind of older projects like Jan Katapolis, who had this idea of a seed that could grow into a piece of furniture or a city, and then, you know, when you saw the advent of sort of DNA technology coming on, could we kind of these molecular houses and things like that? And weirdly, it's still a dream, isn't it? We're still quite a long way off actually from being able to grow buildings. I mean, we are getting closer, right? But it still might sit there somehow as an ultimate, right? And we talk a lot about the future being grown and stuff. But then, you know, the opposite of that, the decay, the temporality, and the way that we can reconsider use of spaces over time, but not only over time, about, again, how they're used. How can we reuse, but also allow for parts of buildings to decay, perhaps in some way? Again, they're such sort of evocative ideas, which ultimately they rely on some kind of biological agency to ever do that. But again, the challenge comes not only from the material, but also the perception and the acceptance of what a space can be. What can an office be if you rent it? How long do you rent it for, and what condition should it be in during the life course of how long you've rented it for? These are very difficult things to propose outside of what are kind of accepted norms for these things, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that the architectural world and society in general it's definitely challenged with. I mean, when I was looking at how you might create resilience to major wildfire events through the mimicry of plants that have adapted to the fire events, you know, I found that firstly there were three qualitatively distinct different approaches. You had some plants for which the schema was that of resilience. It was to resist. It was through through fire retardants, enabled through a number of processes, biochemical, in that there are certain chemicals embedded, if you like, in their materiality. Then there was also the matter that there were physical attributes, things like the bark of certain types of trees that are pyrophytes, that are fire adapted, actually deflecting the heat. So you've got a sort of a physical solution. And there were, you know, so you had distinct ways in which either singularly or as an assembly, the species were mitigating the risk of wildfire. But then you also had three very distinct ways in which they responded in terms of their resilience more generally. So you had, you know, one group of pyrophytes that they are resilient, and they're resilient enough that if it's a low intensity fire and it's not coming to, or it's a low intensity fire, it could be very frequent, they can resist, they can be retardant indefinitely, effectively, you know, within limits. Then at the other end of the spectrum, you had a class of pyrophytes that they don't even attempt, in effect, to try and resist the fire. That you were talking about fire intensities that are enough to cremate a person, or, you know, to reduce a building to its foundations. And, you know, some of those species actually, they effectively they do what an octopus, female octopus, does. They will use the sort of event to catalyze rebirth, wherein they die, they, if you like, martyr themselves, the parent, to produce the children, which actually then they perform very well, because of course what fire does, like any natural hazard, is it creates space, and that it burns away a lot of the foliage. It creates nutrients, because all of the nutrients from those trees go back into the ground. It creates light. It basically creates the perfect growing conditions. So then after the death of the parent, you have these many children, if you like, birthing and growing up very quickly. But in terms of actually how you, and then there was a third form, which was effectively a hybrid of these. But in terms of how you actually implement and you design a policy for that, it's very difficult, because of course, although there are historical fire regimes, so it tends to be the place that, for example, North California has typically different fire regimes to South California, because of the foliage, properties, and as well as the topography, the wind patterns, and all the rest of it. We've also got a situation where, because of climate change, we are seeing a transition. We're seeing ecological regime shifts, wherein the plants that were, if you like, able to coexist in certain habitats are no more, because the heat and humidity of those areas is changing, and so they are shifting, they're marching, they're doing what evolution has always done. They're changing their geography, and they're doing it in quite a short period of time. So it's an incredibly complex area, but it does strike me that one of the key properties here is biodiversity. It's that there is no longer that industrial solution, that one size fits all. And certainly when you look to building regulations for fire, what we have had and what we still have is a situation where you basically have one set of codes that are marginally augmented to try and fit certain different kinds of fire scenarios. But fundamentally, because it's a fairly superficial change in the nature of those codes, they are not fit for the purpose of the kind of wildfires we're seeing. How do we integrate that biodiversity in building regulations? I don't have the answer to that yet, and it just strikes me that as we think to this problem, it's going to take a lot of different expertise and a lot of experimentation, and probably a lot of false starts before we reach a point at which we can accommodate a complexity in the things that we build and we create and we curate, as opposed to nature, which I'm using nature in the generic term, as in the plants and the fauna that have adapted to this stuff over the epochs.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting, isn't it? I mean, you talk a bit, I guess, in a way about the sort of the theory of succession, right, and things like that. And yeah, I mean, fire in buildings is such a difficult one, isn't it, to experiment with? But it makes me think, is in terms of the policies, are there concepts of theories of succession that could feed into policy frameworks, right? And again, is that a new way to think about these things? This idea that you don't have a fixed policy document, but a policy document that might evolve itself. But yeah, I mean, it always brings back to the complexity of nature, right? And how do we deal with that as architects? How do you get all of that information and things like that? And again, there is no answers, but whether it's been touched on much, but the role of sort of machine learning and artificial intelligence and dealing with kind of large data sets. I think we're starting to see some of that work emerge now, probably less so within the field of biodesign in most cases. But I wonder how that work will start to feed into that kind of stuff. And is that, is there a more intelligent way that we can use things like AI, where we can build the intelligence of nature into the AI? And again, I'm actually not somebody who knows an awful broad sense of AI, but I think that there has been a trend, hasn't there, to kind of embed human intelligence into AI, whereas isn't the more intelligent thing is to embed nature and natural intelligence into AI to do those things. And if you consider things like the sense of smell that a dog has, or a different range of vision that a different species have, for me, I think it would be looking at trying to embed those sorts of intelligences into these models, which maybe then starts addressing the complexities of nature, rather than, again, the kind of typically kind of anthropocentric view of what our intelligence is.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, back then, back when I was writing the publication on that, we were already at the point at which we could gather more data from satellite technologies, from terrestrial, sea and air sensing data, then we could actually compute. We effectively have a massive glut of data that we're only just reaching the point of being able to process. But in terms of processing capacity, back then, we were already at the point at which the leaders in artificial intelligence could compute literally millions, constellations of millions of data points, both that which is anthropogenic, that which, you know, people are feeding in, also from, if you like, the likes of weather stations, so the sort of classic data on temperature, humidity, and so forth, and splice into that sensing data from plants. So actually reading the data coming through from plants as they effectively report through their electrical signals on things like drought and other stresses that they obviously are, you know, adapting to in real time. So we're already at that point, and we were already at the point at which sort of the leading edge technologies were already thinking about how you hybridize biological data and that you know, and actually creating the models. But I haven't seen any major shifts on that. But it, you know, I mean, it does boggle my mind that they've already encoded in DNA the likes of the, you know, the Britannica encyclopedias, all of them, and all this massive amounts of data. And you know, there'll obviously be a lot of information we don't know yet because it's not even mentioned in public, let alone published. But
yes,
really exciting new frontier. At the Bartlett and in your work more generally, how do you sort of bring together the interdisciplinary expertise to, if you like, cover the basis when you're thinking about the kind of problems you're solving?
Yeah, I mean, my work has mainly been with a colleague from microbiology, really. I mean, again, it's something, if you talk about it now that I'm working with a microbiologist, it's not really a new thing anymore. I mean, I think pretty much any biodesigner needs a microbiologist. So, you know, it was good at the time, it's not new, but it's still fundamental to the work. It's fundamental on sort of different levels. I think on one level, it could be fundamental in the conceptual angles of the work, but obviously fundamental in the physical outputs of the work. Because I think, you know, that again, the shift where the architect was engaging with microbiology through experimentation has become something quite common, right? And it's just amazing now that we have architecture courses that have their own labs, right? We call them wet labs, grow labs, because you're usually not allowed to call them a microbiology lab. But ultimately, it's some kind of space that is allowing students to engage directly with microbiological experimentation. Obviously, the challenge is knowledge, because as clever as we are, we're not microbiologists. We haven't been trained usually in microbiology, and we don't have the same background of knowledge, and it would be impossible to expect that, right? So interdisciplinarity, although it's pretty common, I still see it as fundamental. It definitely is a fundamental part of engaging with funding. I've seen, even though the word interdisciplinary is used a lot, it tends to mean different things in different fields, doesn't it? As we know. But yeah, the conceptual side of things, even though we tend to speak different languages, I think the conceptual side of my work has definitely evolved in a different way than if I hadn't have been doing it in an interdisciplinary way.
So it's definitely integral to it. Now I want to come on to what I think is one of your very most exciting projects. You said this was a couple of years ago that you actually worked on this, but I think it's still just mind-blowing. Your, excuse me, Probiotic City. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah. Well, we've been working again with my colleagues at the Bartlett. We've been working on this kind of conceptual idea of changing the materiality of buildings to support growth. So that in itself at the time was a fairly new agenda. You know, it was playing this idea of buildings being generally inert in terms of their materiality, and it was a kind of, I guess, criticism of sort of green walls at the time, which were very much a good thing. We're in support of them, but they were not changing the way we design buildings necessarily, and they weren't really changing the way we were inhabiting buildings. And so it was this kind of conceptual idea of the bark of a tree could become like this kind of metaphor for the building envelope or the building substratum. And so we were looking at changing material properties, and we got on this kind of idea of bioreceptivity and bioreceptive design at the time of, could we actually manipulate materials to optimize growth of living systems, usually within a sort of climatic discourse. So usually photosynthetic organisms. Again, these are not new stories now. They felt new at the time, not so much anymore. But I think that the big kind of maybe the conceptual underlying of what we were doing at the time was sort of a rejection of the container. And what we really meant by that was we were conceptually challenging the idea that you could take what happens in a petri dish and put it on the side of a building, or you could take something that happens in a bioreactor in a laboratory and put it onto the side of the building. And if we take something like the BIQ house, the algae house as an example, as much as we like that project, the idea that you have kind of laboratory controlled monoculture growth on a building quickly maybe runs out of steam once things start to question within the broader discourse of anthropocenic change and stuff like that. And so we were challenging that idea of the container, partly because of cost and the challenge of doing it too. And so the notion of exposure was really the thing. Could we actually grow these things on the actual architecture of the material? At the time, it was an outward kind of looking thing. It was about greening cities. But I think the shift happened. I got some funding through the AHRC, which was to do with novel ways to reduce antimicrobial resistance. And there was a big cross-council funding initiative at the time. The AHRC had a kind of quite small pot compared to the medical guys, as usual is the case. And they were great because they funded some really experimental projects at the time. There was a great project by Nick Brown up at York. I forget the names of some of it, but there was some really kind of interesting projects doing exactly what we've been talking about at the start. Having the freedom here to be experimental, I think because it came from the AHRC, they weren't expecting, 4 papers of medical data to quantify and prove what we're doing here. It was experimental, and it was using the role of design in these things, design and social sciences. And so the notion of exposure was a fundamental part of that, and it really was rejecting the use of antibiotics. So the spread of antimicrobial resistance, weirdly, is in part a result of our antimicrobial approaches, right? Or antibiotic mentalities, if you want to call it that. And so it was a rejection of that. Say, we won't use chemicals that kill 99.9% of bacteria. Instead, we use something that's living to inhibit the growth of what we might call bad germs, antimicrobial resistant germs, but not destroy everything, right? Not eradicate everything. And that was really where the kind of the notion of probiotic came in as a kind of an opposition to antibiotic. And that was really how the work started. So it had quite a specific focus at the time, but then of course it engaged with much broader kind of conversations of, the emergence of microbiome science, the emergence of, the human, the contemporary human as a holobiont, in opposition to the sort of the modern body. But even just, more relational understandings of disease that has changed quite a lot over the years. I think we've been so tied to kind of germ theory of disease and kind of Koch's postulates as this idea that microbes and disease is a linear agenda. Well, we now know that's very much not the case. And so it was really engaging with that. And that's where the probiotic came in. So it wasn't probiotic in the kind of narrow sense of, a yogurt with some bacteria. And it was a bit rejecting the kind of the antibiotic architectures that have become ingrained probably during modernism.
Brilliant. It strikes me, I remember several years ago, it was back in 2014, Nesta launched the Longitude Prize, which, as the name suggests, was inspired by the sort of initiatives that would be created of past to rally the scientific community and those that were innovators more generally to get behind the big problems of the day.
Right.
And the Longitude Prize was very much focused on the issue of antibiotic resistance. Now, the nature of that was very scientific in that it was basically encouraging the international community, but really catalyzed from London and from the UK, to look at ways in which, for example, we could find out more information on the problem. We could actually diagnose antibiotic infections more quickly and so forth, so we could effectively make quicker interventions. And I think what's really interesting is Nesta is actually next month, the end of next month, going to be launching the next grand challenges. There's actually 4. And, it really does strike me that this is actually, I know, we were saying it's not new, but this is in many ways radical. When we were talking with Professor Rachel Armstrong last week, she was speaking at some length about microbiology of buildings. And one of the things that we discussed is that the sort of the anti-germ narrative has now changed, because of course we've realized that, as you said, if we eradicate too many germs from our environment, if we eradicate the wrong ones, then we have all sorts of autoimmunity diseases emerge, asthma, peanut allergies, you name it. There's a whole class of inflammatory diseases that are a direct result of killing too many germs in our environment effectively. There's obviously a massive amount of data that shows that, if a family have like a cat or a dog, or the child is sort of regularly running around in the dirt, the probability that they will experience certain sorts of health issues is much lower, or certainly later in life. And one of the sort of concepts that was coming into my mind was that, take the average person on the street and say the word probiotic, and they're probably going to think of something like Yakult, aren't they? Or, the sort of the little pots of drink that we consume maybe with breakfast, that, so say are meant to help your gut flora. But what this struck me as, this is the inverse of that, in that if you're thinking about human health, and actually you could argue the sort of health environment more generally, because obviously it's not only going to be our microbiome and our resilience that is going to be affected if we are sort of disinfecting and destroying germs en masse, but it will be those within some of the wider built environment. This is kind of the inversion. This is where you're not so much just, you're not focusing on the microbiome of your gut, but of your surroundings. And this, I was thinking of the term, this is the microbial womb, basically, where you could effectively curate the microbial community of a home, obviously potentially so that it is going to build the resilience of, certainly if they are babies and young children within that home. But, I wonder if maybe, with the right scientific research, this could be a remedial process as well, wherein there are certain diseases that could potentially be improved, whereupon the interior biome, the microbiome, is improved. What do you think about that?
Yeah, look, I mean, it's exactly the area of my work. I will say that the science around the microbiome is still relatively new, and our understanding really of what are good or bad bacteria may not even be distinguishable in that sense. So it's definitely still an emerging thing. So it's definitely not something that I as a designer am making direct health claims. I mean, I think to just sort of taking a few steps back of it, obviously, health was a big agenda in sort of the early modernism. I think what we tend to see is that the majority of the improvements in the city actually came under miasma theory. This was before we really understood that germs or bacteria were a source of disease and infection. So the massive health reforms that came with the hygiene revolution were all based on miasma theory, right? So they were based on actually a misunderstanding of health and disease, but they still solved many of the problems. So the sort of shift from the sort of the dirty industrial city to the hygienic city solved a huge number of those problems. Antibiotics came along, okay, and had a huge period of success initially, okay, in treating infections that buildings couldn't fix. So you had the sort of sanatoriums of modernism that tried to cure tuberculosis, right? And there was a sense that architecture could heal. But obviously that came with a misconception. They didn't know it was bacteria. And when antibiotics came along, they did a few things. Firstly was they shifted health back into a completely medical discourse. Okay, so the role of design and architecture were no longer seen as relevant, and so attention shifted to other things, as it would, and things looked good. Antibiotics were doing their thing, but obviously, as we're seeing now, is that an over-reliance on those antibiotic approaches are now causing what you might call knock-on effects or unintended effects, and you've already kind of labelled a few of them. The sort of 50-year rise in autoimmune diseases. If you look at that graph compared to infectious diseases, they do the opposite thing, right? And so I think, the COVID situation in particular has brought disease back into an urban sphere again. But I think that these they're called pathologies of absence or diseases of missing microbes, right? They are an urban problem again, and they make the built environment a fundamental part of that. And it is, you're right, the kind of general term of probiotic sounds pretty kind of, flimsy, doesn't it? A lot of people are not really believing in probiotic science and yogurts, and probably rightly so, because there's not a huge amount of evidence that they actually do what they're saying. But the way Jamie Lorimer uses the word probiotic in his book is this kind of much broader definition, right? It's using life to manage life as opposed to using chemicals to extinguish life. And this really sits within a much broader thing, as you say. It's not just about one or two species here. It's a much more global, multi-species flourishing agenda. I mean, I'm using, I think they're Jamie's words actually. And you know, architecture plays a key role in that, absolutely. And will we get to the point where we can design an indoor microbiome that is healthy? I mean, again, that might be on one of your Boyle's lists that we've talked about. Absolutely, why not? Now, lots of challenges that, you know, would an indoor microbiome that's good for me be good for you, be good for someone else? And, you know, then you get into this kind of idea of personalized medicine and all based on kind of genetics and histories. So again, it brings up the thing of complexity again, doesn't it? And how do we start to do that? But I see fundamentally the role of design here at the moment is engaging with these contemporary conditions. Okay, so the emergence of the microbiome, the human as a holobiome fundamentally changes everything, because the modern body of the human was based on the idea that microbes and disease were linear, which meant that in order to be healthy, you had to exclude microbes, and that meant you would exclude disease. Now we know that's not the case anymore, because the holobiome is fundamentally bacterial. So the idea of separating the human and non-human in the contemporary body doesn't make sense anymore. But we still do that in our cities, don't we? We still work on principles of exclusion as our kind of default thing, and so engaging with that's super important. The understanding of disease is changing. Again, it's not a linear relationship between a microbe and a body. Okay, we know it's much more complex than that. We know that the environment plays a hugely important role in that. And medicine has always known this. There was always some people that got ill when there was a bug around and some people didn't, right? And as much as we talk about kind of germ theory and Koch's postulates, that it was never linear. It never always worked. And COVID's shown that's more than anything. Why do some people get more ill than others? Well, it's a fundamental thing that's to do with environment, that's to do with your history. And you're right, you know, your microbiome forms from birth, doesn't it? You inherit a large number of your microbes, but the others come from the environment. And this is where the built environment is crucial. And I let you ask some more questions because I'm talking for a long time, but there's a really interesting case called, I think it's called the Karelia case. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it wrong, but it's a place on the land border between Russia and Finland. And when the Iron Curtain came down, that became more of a hard boundary. And what they've seen is on the Finland side, they've seen a massive increase in these kind of autoimmune illnesses. And so these are two geographically very close areas, yet on the Russian side, they're not getting these cases. And it's all to do with sort of contemporary lifestyles. I don't want to say cleanliness, right? We're not in any way suggesting that we need to forget cleanliness. Hygiene's super important, but it's about exposures. It's about exposures to diversity of microbes. And they've seen it on farm cases too. Yeah, I think you've already said it, you know, people growing up on farms, especially traditional farming, when there's animal and crops, tend to have different immune system development than people growing up in a city, right? It's obvious. Yet we continue to design cities to exclude microbes, to select for as low biodiversity as possible, because it's easier to manage and it's safer and it's healthier. But we know that's not right.
Yeah, you know, I mean, I was thinking the other thing that sort of struck me about this is that when we think of the sort of the classic image, even today, if you put in Future City to a browser, to a search engine, you will get some sort of glass, sparkly, sterile place that really kind of speaks to the idea that, you know, we should, everything should be pristine, and to what are effectively disproven ideas about what, you know, the ideal city is. And so, you know, when I think to this, it strikes me we don't yet really know quite what these new cities that are embedding the principles from across the biodigital, the biomaterial, the biodesign community, we don't know what they'll look like. But it strikes me that they're not, as you say, dirty, but they are certainly not looking to be these, you know, places where the glass, everything's been disinfected, it's been sort of, you know, germs have been eradicated, you know, using every chemical and every device known to humanity. It's a very different thing, and in many ways more like the forest analogy, and that we're trying to reintroduce that biodiversity, be it at the level of plants or macrofauna or microbial. I mean, it's a it is an ecosystem, isn't it?
It is, and I think weirdly at an urban scale, we kind of know what we need to do, don't we? We know we need much more diverse green spaces in cities. It's just not that easy to do that, is it? The
No.
competition for land and space and housing is still there. But yeah, I think generally at the urban level, we know kind of the things we need to do. And again, Claudia Pasquera's work, makes a huge deal of reintegrating microbial systems, right? Everything again we exclude from the modern city excludes all of that, right? To bring that back in and do these things. And then, landscape architecture and design has a huge role to play in this. As you say, the kind of the expertise and knowledge that comes with those kinds of discourses being a fundamental part of the city rather than a kind of, a lot of landscape architects always feel that they come into the stage where the building exists and then there's a bit of space around it that you design a landscape. And, I think fundamentally we need to change that system, right? Landscape in many ways needs to become first. And in one of our research groups, that's a lot of what we're doing is kind of making landscape design a fundamental part of the architecture. But the big question is actually more to do with indoor environments. There we know less. We know less what to do and how to do it. And really that's where my work's come in, because it's had this idea of, we always use the word in front of everything because we're having this idea that we're rewilding and reintroducing, restoring microbes into buildings. And it does fit with this idea of, we know a lot about the indoor microbiome now. We know that it predominantly selects for low biodiversity, the way we design the materials we use. And so my work's looking at actually reintroducing microbes into buildings. Again, not through the notion of a container or a bioreactor or growing algae in a tube. I mean, I'm on board with these things, but they lack this idea of exposure, right, through the microbiome. And so it's about understanding the microbial systems and things that go on there, but also the material niches. We have to create niches for these things. And whether your analogy is a forest or not, I mean, it kind of is in my head anyway, but not literally, or certainly not kind of the aesthetic of the forest. But we need to start creating niches for those things.
Absolutely. One of the things that's been building throughout the series, so we know we're already at the stage when many people have what is in effect a kitchen garden, but actually in their kitchen. So they might be growing herbs on the windowsill, salads or whatever. We had Rachel Horton-Kitchlew is creating urban fungariums so that people can very easily grow mushrooms, edible mushrooms within their kitchens and homes more generally. We had Gavin and Alice from Fullgrown who have been growing furniture orchards. Now, there was the agreement that it's too technical for most people to do in their own garden, but certainly community level growing of furniture is something that we concluded was a possibility. Professor Rachel Armstrong, she threw in that she wants a microbial reactor in every home. She wants low energy, the 12-volt home, and so that the microbial sort of activity in tandem with certain other renewable energy sources would power up the homes. When you think to your work, to the probiotic home concept, can you at this stage visualize? Do you think you're any closer to sort of picturing what kind of devices or what sort of methodologies there might be for reintroducing microflora of the right kind into homes?
Yeah. I mean, firstly, the diversity of approaches. I'm completely on board with this. I mean, I think what happens in academia is you tend to be quite narrow in your focus in order to try and make the work rigorous. And it's not that I in any way am not interested in those kinds of things. It's just that my work has specifically been focused on the material agenda. And again, I still think the role of containment is something that we shouldn't fall into the trap that because it's in a container it makes it safer, and then people are more willing to accept it. So yeah, my kind of work has always been about designing materials in terms of their kind of chemical properties in a way that they can support the growth. And so it's usually used sort of porous materials, and then that brings in notions of moisture and things, which still scares a lot of people, doesn't it? I mean, we generally try to avoid moisture in buildings. And if you read the science of the indoor microbiome now, it's described as a sort of a microbial wasteland. So we have done very well in stopping microbes growing in our buildings. So obviously the flip side of that is if we do know certain types of microbes are beneficial for us, how do we get them into our spaces in the first place? And you're absolutely right that there's a lot of evidence that shows that dogs and cats are very good vectors of environmental microbes, because they literally bring them from the outside inside. They also bring it down at the low level, which is very good for kids and young children, because they're crawling about on that kind of, sub-meter microbiome, which I think is different from the adult level microbiome. But then, how do you physically put them in? Well, again, yeah, maybe Rachel's right. Do you need a bioreactor where you're growing these things? But then how do you get them out of that bioreactor and start actually getting them into your environment? Because, there's a sense that we only kind of pick up microbes through eating and ingestion, but we don't. We get them in our nasal passages, as we know very well through COVID. We get them on our skin. And so, the transmission, when we use the transmission, it's always been a negative thing, hasn't it? Disease transmission or microbial transmission. But we have to flip that agenda, right? And look at ways that not only can we get microbes into our environment, but how do we orchestrate or plan or encourage the interactions and touching and breathing and rubbing our eyes, again, as we were told not to do during COVID. Well, that is how you acquire microbes. So it's a difficult one, isn't it? How do you change people's perceptions on that? And I think the COVID situation has certainly brought microbes again back on a larger public agenda, but it's also kind of highlighted how our response is fundamentally antibiotic, isn't it? And in order to get into a building, you had to prove you were free of microbes. Even though we know as a holobiome, we're not meant to be free of microbes. Look, okay, it's a very clear, in this case, something that's very pathogenic, but it just shows that despite this knowledge, the mentalities are not changing yet, right?
No.
And that's why I still think we are still in those early stages where there's a need for highly speculative projects to tackle the agendas. But then there are the kind of more rigorous, real side of these things that needs to engage with the science of it, so that we can start to build the agenda properly, potentially into policy again.
Yeah. And you think, because we monitor so many things these days, people wear smartwatches, they're monitoring their sleep, their heart rate and what have you. Obviously the challenge with the microbiome is that there are thousands and thousands of microbes out there. So within the sort of boundaries of current science and technology, we couldn't monitor them all. But we know that we can monitor certain classes because we've been doing it with COVID. Can you visualize a sort of a situation where maybe we're sort of monitoring our microbiomes in our houses? And if we did, do you think that would be a sort of a digital process wherein, you sort of had a sensor, not necessarily on your smartphone, but on another technical device? Or do you think we're at the point where it's sort of possible to even sort of conceive some sort of material, some biomaterial that maybe has been genetically modified or had something done to it, and so that it will actually register when there is a certain microbe or community of microbes are in your home and give you an indication of the sort of whether or not the level is safe? Do you think that's let's say a timeline of here to 2100? Do you think that might be possible?
Yeah, no, I do, absolutely. Yeah. And how digital or not that might be, I'm not sure. I've always seen it as a digital thing because it's something we can engage with, and people have a sense of security when they can see sort of numbers, can't they? I think the kind of science at the moment, again, I've asked quite a few microbiologists now along these lines of questions and said, as a starting point, which species should we use? Which strain should we use? And none of them ever want to commit, because again, the science is not there to say that is definitely a beneficial microbe for health, right?
Yeah.
So that's why the sort of the AMR agenda has been easier to deal with, because it was about inhibiting specific pathogens but not others. But when it comes to the idea of actually what's healthy, the science is not there. But what seems to be the case is this notion of microbial diversity, right? And it's generally, if you kind of go along the lines of Graham Rook's kind of old friends theory, do you know that one?
No.
So that's the one that Graham Rook was at UCL, and he kind of expanded upon the original hygiene hypothesis, which was, I think, Strachan who did the original one. And the original hygiene hypothesis got media twisted with this idea that we're living too clean, right? And that was the hygiene hypothesis, was not saying that. Graham kind of adapted it a bit more and is very critical of that, but he calls it the old friends theory, and he says it's the type of organisms that we would, or actually our gut would have evolved with over the millions of years going backwards. So these tend to be environmental microbes from soils and things like that. So microbial diversity means to be in an environment where there's more environmental microbes than human microbes. And our indoor environments are probably the other way around at the minute. We're probably mostly exposed on a daily basis to human microbes. And so I love that idea that, yeah, there could be kind of some kind of sensor, either as a wearable or as a part of your home, that if we didn't want to push that too far, it could just be some kind of measure of microbial diversity. And it could be that as that diversity drops, there could be some kind of sensor. So there you're not committing to saying, yes, you've got good microbes, but we know that dropping in environmental diversity generally means that that's going to be problematic, and it could go either way, couldn't it? And we've been so used to disease and things being discussed through the presence of microbes, that we also know the absence of microbes is problematic. And so for me, it creates this kind of interesting scale that you could play on. The idea that you're in a safe zone of diversity, which, even though it might not be specifically labeled as healthy, you know that there's a general amount of diversity there, which is probably likely to be beneficial. See, I'm taking the role of the scientist now. I don't want to commit to any particulars, but look, of course, the dream isn't it? There's if we look at the future of medicine as part of the idea that they can map your genome. Surely at some point there could be this idea that by understanding your genome, you could work out the type of microbes that you need as part of your daily exposures based on your genome, right? Your history, your cultural background, if that even affects it. I don't know if it does, but I'm guessing it probably does.
Well, I know, like 23andMe and companies sort of doing the whole DNA health testing stuff. I know they've had some really interesting data come through. They were very much prevalent in understanding what kind of genetics framed how you might respond to COVID. Obviously, we found, the level obviously of analysis for COVID, because of it being a global pandemic, that converged at a time when we can see much more information on the genome and on how we respond and so forth. It strikes me that that's absolutely possible. I know another thing that has come out, a big area of science of really the last few decades, is understanding which particular sort of genetic indicators not only show obviously a vulnerability to COVID, but to whole classes of disease. So I know that my genes suggest I'm pretty resilient as it goes to COVID, or so say. But then when it comes to the bubonic plague, I'm a sitting duck. So if there were sort of pathogenic interventions that could be created through my microbiome, I'm there. I'm with you on that, Richard. So
but then it's super interesting, but this raises other things in that we tend to talk about health as purely a kind of a genetic and an inherited thing, but it's also becoming pretty clear now that the environments we're exposed to shape our health, and that means physically but also mentally. So we know that people who are of low socioeconomic backgrounds tend to suffer with health conditions, and that's not a genetic thing, right? That's because of the environments that they live in during their early years. We know that people who are abused physically and mentally are more predisposed to certain things. So this is where we have to stop thinking about health as purely this genetic thing, and understand that the holobiome, not only as a microbial holobiome, but as a fundamental result of our environment, of our relationships with people. We know that people who don't have caring relationships with parents are predisposed in some way. So, this is, again, we talk about sort of interdisciplinarity, and we often talk about designers and microbiologists, because they're the two that really fit in the kind of bio-design agenda, aren't they? But I also think there's, it needs to be much broader than this. We need to be working with social scientists a lot more and engaging with research that can start to answer those questions as well.
I'm thinking all the teenagers of the world that don't want to clean their bedrooms and now thinking if they listen to this, they've got their argument. They'll turn around to the parents and say, I'm creating a microbe-rich environment here. That's why I left the plate under my bed for 3 weeks.
I mean, as a disclaimer, then let's definitely not confuse cleanliness and hygiene as our first line of defence of health. Okay, washing your hands is fundamentally important. We just don't need to use antibiotic hand wash 6 times a day. I mean, my kids at school were coming home during the COVID thing when all their skin was sore, and they were using antibiotic hand wash or thing like 5-6 times a day. And I mean, I think I don't want to quote directly, but I think Graham calls it antibiotic theatre, right? It's just the perceived safety of sterility and being antibiotic as a way to prevent health. It makes us do things that are not evidence based. They don't follow the models that we know, yet we do them anyway, right? Or we're told to do them anyway.
Absolutely.
The government board that led the COVID thing was predominantly led through a behavioural science discourse. There were I don't think there were hardly any social scientists on any of the government boards looking at the role of all these other things that we know play fundamental roles in how people's health develops and how people respond to these pandemics.
Yeah, no, it was an exercise in what can work and what can't work, wasn't it? The pandemic and sort of the narratives of the various governments around the world. Also interesting to see how different nations, the people's different nations responded. And yeah, I mean, I know that the data from that is still being analysed, isn't it? And it's still being processed. But yeah, certainly in the UK, it was a sort of fairly problematic public health campaign in terms of educating people what was the safest thing to do. Now we have, to anyone who's watching, if you have any questions for Richard, type them in the little comment box and we'll just fit them in. But there are 2 questions, Richard, that we ask everyone in the series. The first question is, the year is 2050. What does the biomaterialized world look and feel like?
Okay, for me, it's the opposite of the modernist, smooth, white, pristine surface, right? It's probably the opposite of the beauty of the iPhone, right? It's looking at textures, geometries, porous materials. I mean, we always use these kind of words of dampness and wetness as in some kind of biological context, but there needs to be roles for that. And it's this idea that our buildings are, definitely not inert, but they're either living or they're seeded with living agency in them, whether that's literal living materials or byproducts or bits of old DNA from living system, but done so in a sort of a curated way, right? It's not a random left to chance thing. It's done based on scientific knowledge, but also with the agenda of not following science purely as a database system, but to change the way that we use our spaces and we use our buildings.
That's a great vision. And the second question, you have one wish. If a genie popped out of a magical lamp, a test tube, or even a biodigital contraption and granted you just one wish for our biofutures, what would it be, Richard?
Oh gosh, that's a tough one. Right?
You can, okay.
I mean,
the genie will grant you wishes.
No, I think mine. I think multi-species flourishing within a planetary discourse is still a fundamental dream wish, of which the built environment is a major part of that, but it's at a planetary scale as well, right? I think as important as architecture is, it's a much broader conversation than that. And again, that multi-species flourishing plays with not only a biological species agenda, but in terms of fair and safe environments for the way that societies can live.
Brilliant. Well, you have been more than generous with your time, Richard. I think we've gone quite over. You are officially our longest BioFutures conversation.
Oh, no, that means I talk too much.
No, not at all, not at all. Very brilliant points there, and it's been really interesting hearing. I think actually you're one of our only scientists actually in the series, and it has.
No, I'm not. I'm not a scientist.
Yeah, well, you were a scientist. You were trained as a scientist, so you've now evolved into something different.
Yeah, I pretended to be for a little while.
But it was very interesting, because some of the positions that you took and some of the perspectives, were slightly different, which is, positive. It adds to our ecosystem of concepts here.
Yep.
We'll next week be joined by Claudia Pasquero and Maria Capsova. So hopefully we will expand on some of the things that we've discussed. And
yeah, I know them. I know them both, and they're going to be great. So that'll be a really good one.
Yeah. So we have three, well, actually four, including Maria, four experts working in this field. So I'm really pleased that we've got this into the first series. So thank you, Richard, for joining us. It really has been a pleasure, and hope to catch up with you when at the Bartlett.
Absolutely, and thanks for the invite as well.
Take care, and thank you to everybody for watching. Claudia and Maria will be joining us May 25th, same time next week. So take care. Bye bye.
Thanks, Melissa. Bye.